Hello, everybody. My name is Letty Rising, and today's topic for our webinar is going to be self-assessment as formative assessment. So it's really important to realize that you as the teacher are not the only person who is involved in the formative assessment process. Often when we think of the word assessment, we think of something that the teacher does to evaluate the work, to how the work has been produced, and talking with the child, and us kind of creating the criteria and setting the stage. But when it comes to self-assessment, this is one of the most powerful and underutilized tools, and it really falls in line with the Montessori philosophy and other progressive educational models where we are working on having the child take ownership over their learning. And self-assessment is a way that a student can take ownership over their learning and also get really excited about the learning process and the assessment process. However, self-assessment is something that needs to be modeled and it needs to be taught. So it's not something that, you can just hand, a student back a essay that they wrote or something and say, okay, assess your work. You can't just sort of like do that. You're going to need to give them some tools, some techniques, and it's a skill to be learned. But it's a really important skill because it helps the child self-correct. A lot of times in Montessori in the early years, particularly for 3 to 6, there is a lot of talk about self-correcting materials. And we don't have as much self-correcting materials in 6 to 12 as there are in 3 to 6. Obviously, a lot of the math materials are designed that way. But when it comes to writing and written work, self-assessment is a wonderful tool to help the child learn how to self-correct and therefore become much more independent in their learning process and experiences, and helps them less rely on the teacher and more rely on themselves. To figure out what is quality work and where mistakes are and how they can repair those mistakes and move forward with the next work that they're doing. So a major goal of self-assessment is to help the students monitor, assess, and take ownership over their learning experience. Again, we really want them to take that ownership as early as possible, and they can do it a lot earlier than people might think. Lower elementary children can begin the self-assessment process, and upper elementary children definitely can be self-assessing with their work. So understanding how we learn best is something that has to be taught. So a lot of times, you as the teacher and the guide are going to be pointing out to individual students, it seems like you learn things well when people tell you things, or when you are, write things down, that seems to help you a lot. That doesn't mean that they are ignoring all the other modalities, but it's really understanding how to let them know that, that we need to have some sort of like guidance in understanding how people in general learn best and what are the best strategies for retaining information and developing skills. And it's not enough to tell them to, okay, go ahead and go self-reflect or go self-assess. We have to give them the tools and offer them the opportunities to practice and improve these things over time. So that's the other thing, is we're not only giving them the tools, but we have to give them opportunities to practice these things. It's really important. During self-assessment, students identify their strengths and their weaknesses, and then they can revise accordingly. And so there isn't an outside entity pointing out things to them. They are doing that internally. And again, we are really all about intrinsic motivation, autonomy, independence, and self-direction in Montessori environments, as well as other progressive environments. And that's something we really want to build upon. So let's talk about a little bit more about why self-assessment is important. So self-assessment promotes the skills of reflective practice and self-monitoring. So if they can learn to sort of self-monitor their work along the way and say, okay, I know that sometimes I forget to put a question mark at the end of a question, or I forget to put my quotations and dialogue. So when I'm writing, I'm going to check over and see where people were talking and where they were asking questions and make sure that I included those things. So, you know, if a child knows that they have a tendency to forget those things, they can self-assess. Another thing is that self-assessment promotes academic integrity through student self-reporting of their learning progress. So them self-reporting and kind of talking about where they feel like they were strong and where they feel like they can improve upon their work, particularly when it comes to research writing and stories and reports, that can really help them build their skills. It develops, as I mentioned earlier, self-directed learning, so they're not relying on the teacher to make check marks and point out their mistakes, you know, where they were struggling. You know, they can do that on their own with some practice and some coaching and some guidance from their teacher. It also increases student motivation. We tend to be a little bit more motivated when we have ownership over things. And so if the teacher is the one creating the guidelines for self-assessment, or even just assessing themselves, well, if the teacher is creating the assessments, or they are, if they have just guiding the children on that, and they are not collaborating with the children on that, then it can be a really demotivating experience for the child sometimes, because they want some input on, you know, talking about what does quality work mean to me, and having a negotiation and a collaboration with the guide, and even with as a guide with your whole classroom. If you're talking about the writing process, say, you know, what makes good writing? Like, what can we agree on are some things that make good writing? And if the more that they participate and contribute to those discussions, the more that they are going to feel connected to the process, and they're going to feel a lot more buy-in for what is happening, and be much more receptive to the entire process. A self-assessment also helps students develop a range of personal and transferable skills. They can self-assess with their writing, and then that can translate to self-assessing with math, or with their reading comprehension, or even self-assess when it comes to their social and emotional connections and relationships with others in terms of their communication style and practice. So, you know, they can transfer these self-assessment and self-reflection skills to other areas. You know, just wanting to sort of maybe a little bit of a digression here, but one of the most important things for myself when I am hiring teachers, I've been a school leader for many years, is finding teachers who have the capacity to self-reflect. They can stop and say, there's an area where I made a mistake, or an area I need of growth, and how can I work on that to do better? And, you know, this is a skill that I have found that we really want to be teaching the students in all areas of their lives, beginning in the elementary years. And this can very easily start with your role playing and your social situations that you're having in classroom, and through classroom meetings when you're having discussions about conflicts that are happening, and talking about feelings, and really having them check in with themselves and self-assess about their own behavior. So behavior self-assessment is a really important thing to be considering as well. So let's talk about some considerations to keep in mind when engaging in self-assessment. So the process of self-assessment requires instruction, and it requires sufficient time for students to learn. So again, this isn't something where you're just like, okay, here's your paper that you wrote the other day, or pull out one of your favorite pieces of work, and why don't you assess it and let me know how it is. You're going to find students who are going to say, what does that mean? Or, oh, I think it's good. And they're going to be very abstract and vague because they don't know exactly what you want or what you're thinking about. And you haven't had a conversation that talks about what does it mean to be self-assessing and to do it effectively. A lot of times students are used to a system where they have little or no input into how they are assessed, and they're often unaware of assessment criteria. So, you know, even in Montessori classrooms where we are not necessarily assessing children formally all the time, you know, there are things that we as teachers are looking for and sort of maybe having some expectations that we haven't made clear to the students. And it's really important to say, you know, you are 11 or 12 years old, and so I see that you wrote this report, and it looks a little bit more like a summary because it's about a half a page, and I'm wondering if we can expand upon that and include a lot more different variables to create a very robust writing experience. So, you know, but if they don't know that ahead of time, then maybe they just think, okay, I'm going to write a report and it's half a page summary, and they may not know exactly what would be expected for somebody of their age range. So that you're going to want to be very explicit about what the assessment criteria is. Maybe you want your students to have good penmanship when they do a final draft, but you've never told them that, and you're like, oh gosh, they gave me this thing, and I mean, it's a good piece of writing, but it's so messy, I can hardly read it, and it doesn't really seem like a polished piece. But if you've never conveyed that to the children ahead of time, they're not going to know that. One of the most important things you can do as a teacher is to let them know ahead of time what you want, what you expect, and what you are thinking and imagining. And also to ask them what their thoughts are ahead of time as well, so that everybody can be on the same page before work begins. You know, in a traditional setting, students might want to know how much their self-assessment will count towards their final grade. We don't have to worry about that in Montessori settings. But again, it's still important for them to know what is going on in that regard, in terms of like, you know, what is valuable for you, and hopefully you guys are creating that together, so that between the student and the teacher, that you are both creating criteria for self-assessment. So incorporating self-assessment can also motivate students to engage with the material more deeply. So if you talk about, you know, let's look at, like, you know, when you are writing this reflection about what you read, why don't you look at the tone and look at the different kinds of, you know, pay attention to conventions and spelling and punctuation, and also identify the main idea. So, you know, these kinds of things that if you're telling them about ahead of time, that's going to, you know, help them really engage with the material more deeply. Another thing to consider when doing self-assessment is self-assessment can take a little bit more time. I mean, it's so much easier for a teacher to say, okay, hand in your favorite piece of work in the basket that you did, and I'll revise that and you can create a final draft. There's an example of something I've sometimes seen in Montessori settings where the teacher isn't revising everything and checking everything, but they'll say, okay, pick your favorite piece, put it in the basket, and I will, I'll mark through it, and then you can create a final draft based upon my edits. So that really isn't self-assessment. How you can really, but you can also, you don't have to move all the way to, okay, you read through and check what you think, where you think you made some errors or things you want to fix or change, looking at it a second or a third time. You can also kind of, I guess you could say, co-assess on the path to self-assessment. So that means that you can sit down together and kind of talk through it and say, I'm going to read this and I'm going to reflect upon this as if I'm the person who wrote it. I'm going to have that conversation out loud. Oh gosh, it looks like that I'm confusing my verb tenses when I'm writing. So I want to make sure I have a consistent tenses while I'm writing. Am I in the present tense? Am I in the past tense? I'm going between first person and third person in my writing. Let me think about that. Oh, I see that I'm forgetting my quotations and dialogue here. And so you can kind of, have those out loud conversations with them so that they can hear that, and then they can incorporate that into their own thinking when they are self-assessing. But like the big point to make here is that self-assessment can take a lot more time. And so you need to be patient at the beginning, just like when you're teaching the children anything. That it takes a little time at the beginning, but once they are rolling with it, it becomes much more automatic, and it's going to make your life easier as a teacher in the long run, even though in the short run, laying that foundation is going to take more time than you would have expected, but it's worth it in the end. So here's another interesting consideration when using self-assessment. And this is actually something that I have found to be true with students all the time and always, even when it comes to self-assessing their own behavior. So research shows that students can be much more strict and firm on their own self-assessment than the teacher would be on an assessment. So they actually are going to be harder on themselves a lot of times than you would be. And, I'm just thinking of a very easy example of, self-assessing with behavior. If you ask students, okay, there seems like there's here's a behavior that's happening that we're seeing a lot. Does anybody have any ideas about how we can fix this behavior or adjust this behavior? Or what are some consequences to this behavior that everybody can agree upon? You'll always see a few children raise their hands and say something incredibly firm that you would never have expected. So children can be a lot harder on themselves than we are. So you want to make sure to look out for that and make sure that they're not being too hard on themselves, because self-assessment really is about helping them learn to catch their own errors and mistakes and helping them to learn and grow. So, and they need to really, you as the teacher need to convey that is the main purpose of self-assessment is growth. It's not to judge, it's not to mark and, put them in a category of smart or not smart. You really want to avoid those things. But that, really stress that self-assessment is all about growing and learning. What are some benefits of self-assessment? We've talked about a few, but there's a lot of benefits for self-assessment, and which makes it really valuable for teachers to implement, even though, as we said before, it takes a little more time. Benefits are there is increased student engagement, and it also empowers students, allowing them to have greater autonomy. So, they really get more engaged if they're part of that process, as opposed to if you, the teacher, are the one assessing all the time. It improves motivation and perseverance, and it encourages students to seek and know where to find help besides you as the teacher. So sometimes like that self-assessment involves them looking in a dictionary or a thesaurus or an almanac to look something up, or a book on writing conventions. Maybe it also means them checking in with their peers. That can be a part of the self-assessment project or process as well. Another benefit is it develops students' self-regulation skills and their metacognition skills. So they really get to understand how they learn best and really play to those strengths. I know for myself, when I am, for example, when I was learning a foreign language when I was in high school, which is, in America, we learn foreign languages late. We really should be doing it earlier than that. But I found that when I made mistakes in my vocabulary, if I, took a vocabulary test and didn't do well, one of the best strategies for me is to write. And I write to retain. And so writing the vocabulary words several times over and again, and then saying them aloud as I'm doing it, is a way for me to retain that information. So, you can use that sort of, I sort of did that as like, okay, I didn't do well on this vocabulary test. Just reading them over and over wasn't actually helping, because I saw that that wasn't making me learn it quickly. And then I tried another strategy. Oh, let me write them down. And so, okay, that's a way of self-assessment. I first saw that I tried to say them over and over. That didn't work. Then I tried writing them over and over, and that did work. And so then I realized that was the strategy that worked for me in terms of learning and retention. So, your students will go through those kinds of process too, and you can also help them point out, oh, it seems like that you really, that really worked well for you, or you're really understanding that concept. What were your strategies that you used that helped you with that? So these are things that you can talk about with your students. They need to learn about metacognition, which is learning how you learn. How does the brain work when we are retaining information and learning information? And these are important things. You won't as much talk about that with your youngest elementary children, but as they get into be, 9, 10, 11, 12, it's definitely a conversation you want to have more frequently. Another benefit of self-assessment is that it gives the student a strong sense of self-efficacy for developing their own effective study habits. This is a little bit related to the example I recently gave about myself and in my Spanish class and learning vocabulary. But having a sense of self-efficacy is like, okay, I tried something, I did it, I was successful, I feel really good about myself, I know I can be a learner, and I know I can grow and learn in things that are hard if I take my time and I practice and I employ some successful strategies. It also helps enrich the students' reasoning and improves their communication skills. Again, they're going through the process of what works and what doesn't work, and that develops reasoning and logic skills. And they also, it helps them develop communication, because when they are talking with their teacher and having their weekly or bi-weekly conferencing time, they can sit with their teacher and talk about, they will use vocabulary that is sort of a shared vocabulary that they have developed, talking about the process of self-assessment and what strategies they use to employ self-assessment in their work. Self-assessment also helps students understand and apply quality criteria to their work. So ultimately, it increases the quality of their work. If they can look through it and say, okay, if you have some sort of a checklist or a rubric, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit, it could be like, did you make sure your penmanship was good, that you have your punctuation in order, that you used varied vocabulary in this, did you accompany your writing with some illustrations? So if there is some sort of a checklist or rubric that they can use to self-assess, that is going to take a little bit of work off your plate in terms of, having conversations with them about this a lot, because they have maybe a checklist or a rubric nearby. And it also helps them develop sort of the, they start, reading these things over and over again. And so it becomes very natural to them to, okay, let me check this over and make sure I have this, and this in here to make sure that I did my best work. So let's talk about how to get started with assessments. So you're going to want to identify what work and criteria is to be assessed in the first place. And again, you're going to want to do that with your students. Montessori is a very collaborative approach, and if you are in a Montessori setting, we are often developing tools and assessments with the students so that they have input in that. So we want to identify what is to be assessed. Is it that they're going to, as a teacher, you can define that. Maybe you're going to ask every child or every student to pick one piece of writing every week or every other week that they are going to self-assess. Maybe one piece of, math work, or maybe they're going to, maybe you're going to have them assess projects and activities that they're doing in the class, and you're going to need to develop a criteria for project assessment. You're going to want to articulate that your expectations are clear, and that the criteria that you are using to assess are clear for the task at hand. Again, you can do that through a rubric or a checklist, and we can talk about that a little bit later on. You also want to motivate students by framing the assessment as an opportunity to reflect objectively on their work, determine how their work aligns with the assessment criteria that you developed together, and determine ways for improvement. So, you really want to frame it as a way to improve. Again, this is not something, you don't want them to get the impression that assessment is about you judging whether or not their work was good enough. You are not judging, you are supporting, you are facilitating, and you are helping them learn and grow. You want to provide an opportunity for students to agree upon and take ownership of the assessment criteria. And that can be individually. Maybe when you conference with children, you have children at varying levels often in the classroom, and maybe everybody's assessment criteria will be different. You may also want to have a community meeting and talk about what are some general things that we can agree upon that will identify what is quality work, so that the students know, what does a quality writing sample look like? What does a quality math sample look like? And so that they can have all of that, in their minds when they are beginning and attempting their work. Another thing that I mentioned a little bit earlier, or touched on a little bit earlier, is that you're going to want to draw attention to the inner dialogue that people are engaging in as they produce pieces of work. Children and adults both have an inner dialogue that's happening, and you're going to want to draw attention to that. And the way that you can do that is you want to model that by talking out loud as you solve a math problem, or as you explain the types of decisions you had to think about and make as you moved along through a project, or the process you're going through as you are writing a report or a story. You want to model all these different kinds of learning experiences by doing it out loud. You can do that in a small group lesson. You can also do that in a whole group lesson where you have the children listening to you while you are talking through and working through a problem or a project or a piece of writing. And that's one of the most important things you can do. You know, an example of this could be like, okay, so, you know, I know everybody's going to be making a personal timeline in their classroom, a timeline of their life. So I'm going to kind of talk through the process that I want to go through when I'm making my timeline of life, because I'd like to participate in it as well. So I'm going to start out by getting a long measuring stick and creating some lines, like a long line in the middle, and then I'll have some small lines throughout. And, you know, I think I'm going to mark out by decade for myself, because I'm quite a bit older than you, but then have some little lines in between. I'm going to start with my birth year, and then I'm going to go all the way to the present, and I'll write that down. And so as I'm doing this, I'm doing this as I'm telling them so they can see it. And then, okay, let me write down, oh, I have a little story about when I was born. So I'm gonna write it on a little index card, and then I'm gonna glue it here at the front where I was born. Okay, let me think about this story. Like, let's see, my parents told me that it was raining really hard the night I was born, and the night before I was born, it was my grandma's birthday, but the next day was my dad's birthday, and they were fighting over whose birthday I would be born on, and I ended up being born on my dad's birthday, and it was a very special day for everybody. Maybe I'll write a little bit about that. And then, okay, I'm gonna remember when I was 4 years old, and I went to school for the first time, and my mom let me walk across the field, but I went in the wrong direction. So she had to come and run after me and come get me. And so then when I was 12, I won the school spelling bee, and I was very excited. And so I would go through, so I'm 47 years old. I wouldn't go through all 47 years of my life, but I would give the children some concrete examples of what I'm thinking about when I'm telling a little story that I want to add to my timeline, and how I can create it so they can see that and talk about, well, you know, I did a line right here and I did some little sublines, but you can do, you know, your lines can be longer or shorter, or you can do every 2 years. You can put your dates, or you can put the age that you are. And so really just giving them some examples and talking through it as you're doing it. And so then when they start building their own timeline, they're going to remember the conversation that you had about your own thinking and thought process, and they're going to do it too. So when you're modeling a lesson, I know that in Montessori training, we model the lessons that we do for the children and the things that they see. But we don't always talk about our thought process while we're doing it. So the more that you can engage and involve your thinking process about what you're doing. And, you know, another thing is, as a teacher, you're going to make some mistakes in your lessons. And so it's okay to be like, oh, oops, I made a mistake. Let me think about how I can repair this mistake and come back to where I really plan to bring us all along, and have that conversation and that inner dialogue as well. So anyway, wrapping that up, inner dialogue is really important, and we're going to be modeling our inner dialogue outward, because the children cannot read our minds. And so we are going to help them develop thinking process by sharing our thinking process aloud sometimes, so that the children can benefit from that. So let's talk about a few different types of self-assessment. The ones I'm going to talk about are not the only kinds of self-assessment, but they are definitely some of the main types that you will come across in your classroom environments, or that you may want to use. One type of self-assessment is rubrics and checklists. Another kind is journals and reflections. Another kind is portfolios. And another kind is open-ended self-assessment questions. So let's start out with rubrics and checklists. You know, in Montessori training, there isn't really much talk about rubrics, maybe a little bit with checklists, but they're not a bad thing to incorporate in a Montessori environment. In fact, they're very useful and helpful. Just like everything, you don't need to overdo it and have a rubric or a checklist for every single thing that they're doing during the day. You know, the children in Montessori classrooms are skill building and practicing continuously all the time. And so evaluating every single piece of writing that they do is not only, how should I say, demotivating, it's also a bit counterproductive, and it creates a lot of exhaustion for the teacher. So you're going to want to think about how often and how frequently you want to analyze work and have the children self-assess. And you know, we are going to want to see, make sure that you don't get too excessive with it. You want to find a balance. So let's talk about rubrics for a minute. So a rubric involves a very clear and vivid description of what exemplar work looks like and what is not exemplar work. So that means, like, what is a sample of high quality work and what is not high quality work. Rubrics also help the students understand clearly what quality work looks like and provides guidance, in fact, very explicit guidance on how to improve it. For example, if you have a rubric, you know, maybe you have a rubric on how to write a summary. Maybe you gave the children a lesson on writing a summary. If you have a small group lesson, you talked about all the components of writing a summary, and then you create a rubric and you give it to them, and then you are going to have them create their own summary of something that they read or you read, and that, you know, that they have, you know, some sort of a writing on hand that they can create a summary from. The rubric might have 4 different categories at the top. It might be exceeds standards, meet standard, approaching standard, or not yet approaching standard. And then you're going to want to have, you know, some basic little categories. For example, maybe you're going to have a category for paraphrasing the writing into a summary, and exceeding standard would be no more than 4 words in a row are taken directly from the story that you summarized. And, you know, at the opposite end, where a student is not yet approaching standard, it might say, you know, the rubric might say 3 or more sentences contain more than 4 words in a row that are taken directly from the story. And that's very clear because, you know, when you're summarizing, you're not supposed to be taking things directly from the source, but you're supposed to be paraphrasing, reorganizing words and sentences, and creating a summary that's based on your own words. So, you know, that's a very clear rubric. You also might want to have, you know, an area of focus. You know, summary consists of main idea and important details only. That would be something that would be exceeding the standards. And something that is not yet even approaching standards would be the main idea of the story is not discussed. So if they have this form, this rubric, while they are creating a summary, this is going to help them in the self-assessment process. So they know exactly what are the expectations for a high quality summary, and you know, even ones that are approaching standards, and what is the criteria for and you know, what does it look like when they are not yet approaching their standards. So you're going to want to take a look at that. And rubrics are really can be a great tool to help them identify learning targets and where they are in terms of their skill building, and help them produce the best work that they can. A checklist is another thing that is similar to a rubric. In fact, it's very similar, except for it lists the learning targets and the expectations and the criteria, but it doesn't include the gradations of quality. So, you know, it's mainly a checklist. You did it or you didn't, you have it or you don't have it, versus gradations of, you know, here's what we mean by your best work, here's what we mean by work that's not approaching mastery. And then so there's, you know, sort of gradations for that. So they both can be great things to use. A lot of times checklists are used for more simple kinds of projects and work, and maybe a rubric would be for something that's a little bit more complex. And again, as we've mentioned earlier, and I will probably say a few more times, is that co-creating rubrics and checklists with students helps increase their sense of autonomy and independence, and helps them take ownership over the expectations. So with your students, you're going to want to identify examples of the ideas, the concepts, the examples that you're looking for in their work samples. It really promotes self-reflection and goal setting. Another thing that we are going to want to, another tool you're going to want to use in the self-assessment project is journals and reflections. So students can keep a daily or a weekly journal to record their reflections on their own learning, their challenges, and their accomplishments in response to prompts that you provide, or even maybe just whatever they are thinking about in their own mind. If you do have a prompt, they might include questions and statements that are similar to those on a reflection sheet that you could create. But, you know, basically in Montessori classrooms, children have work journals, and I have known of, I mostly taught lower elementary, but I've known a lot of upper elementary teachers in particular who have incorporated a daily reflection where they write down, you know, after they've recorded their work for the day, they might sit down at the end of the day and take 10 minutes to write down and reflect on their learning for the day, their challenges, their accomplishments, in response to, you know, whatever their learning experiences was for the day, or maybe the teacher might have a prompt. I have found it's really nice to have a prompt, but then also to let children know that they have the ability to reflect and respond to whatever's coming up for them internally over the prompt, if that feels important to them. So having those two choices is really not a bad idea. It's also really a good thing to know that it's a good idea to have students reflecting throughout the process, and that reflection doesn't just have to happen at the end of something. So, you know, consider allowing them to think about each day's learning and keeping it in their notebooks for a daily summary, and doing it perhaps in the middle of the day and at the end of the day. It doesn't have to just happen at the end, or maybe after a lesson that they did. If you have a small group lesson, maybe they can do a little reflection at that time. In their own words, they can think about what they learned in class that day and how it connects to something they learned before, or how it could connect to other skills and subject areas too. So, you know, and I'm talking a lot about written reflection right now, but don't underestimate or minimize the opportunity for oral reflection, and particularly younger children. As you're helping them develop the reflection process, you can just ask them some simple questions about, you know, what did you think about that activity or that experience or that work that you did or that lesson? And, you know, how did you feel about your, you know, what the work that you completed, and what might you want to do next time, and things like that. So having them orally reflect early on is going to help them with their written reflections as they become more proficient and fluent writers. And, you know, again, one of the best things you can do in terms of reflection for like a 6 or 7 year old who's just new into the elementary classroom is helping them learn how to reflect on their behavior, because there's a lot of behavior things that children have to learn when they come from a Montessori 3 to 6 environment into the elementary environment. Things are different, the rules are different, the children are different. And so there's so much for them to learn, and helping them develop a capacity to self-reflect early on is going to really help them self-assess in terms of their behavior, in terms of their work, and develop self-assessment strategies early on. Another type of self-assessment is portfolios. Portfolios are really great. I actually really love having portfolios in the classroom, and what I love most is when a child will take their portfolio out during the work cycle and just kind of look through it from the beginning to the end, and sort of, they're almost looking at a time capsule. They really enjoy looking at their best work that they've done. Now, teachers have different ways that they keep portfolios. Some teachers have children keep a portfolio of their best work for 1 year, and then they take it home at the end of the school year. And some teachers have their children keep a portfolio for the entire cycle that they are in that classroom. So that could be 3 years or 6 years. But people I know who have classes for 6 years will usually have 2 separate portfolios, because keeping one for 6 years, that's going to be a really big portfolio. But I do see most often it's kept for like a 3-year cycle and or a 1-year cycle, and it's really great because the children can really reflect on their work and look at it and get really excited about seeing how far they've come. But anyway, I digress a little bit there. So a portfolio is an organized collection of student-selected work. They get to choose. Now, sometimes as a teacher, I think that if I see a child has done something that I find really exceptional work, in comparison to maybe other things that they've done, or it's just really standing out, I will suggest, do you want to put that in your portfolio? I think that's a really great piece to include in there. So, if they were going to say, no, I don't want to do that, I'm not going to fight with them about it, but you can certainly suggest it. But you really want them to have that sort of ownership over their work by telling them, this is your special portfolio. This is where we want you to put the work that you're most proud of, that you feel most excited about. And that would be a really neat thing for them to do. And when they enter into the elementary class and they're 6 or 7, it might be that you are suggesting that to them a lot at the beginning until it becomes more automatic for them to think, oh, I'm really proud of this work and I'd like to put it in my portfolio. And that's a really exciting thing when you hear that for the first time from a child who you've been suggesting it to along the way, and eventually they're like, oh, I feel very excited about this. Portfolios also reflect on day-to-day learning activities. So you get to kind of see like their day-to-day work. It's not like that you are, it's not like a test that they've taken, it's their day-to-day work that they are most proud of. Portfolios also document student development and really focus on their growth. And so it's really, that's one of the neat things that they like to do when they're perusing through their portfolios, to see, oh wow, look at how my handwriting was really messy like at the beginning of my portfolio, but now it's like really nice. Or look at my drawing and how much it's more detailed and how like it's better, and look at how I'm using like a lot more color, and oh my gosh, look at my writing, and I used to say everything was nice or cool or fun, and now I'm using lots of like big words in my writing. They notice these things and they get excited to see their growth, because it's, when it's your own self, you don't see your growth, but if there is a documentation of that, they can see that, and that really helps in their self-assessment process. So their portfolio also should include a wide range of student work to build a complete picture of their student development. So, make sure that you have you might want to have there's a couple different ways you can do this. I mean, it could be in there by date. you know, that so like it's a chronology of, you know, from start to finish, their portfolio. You could also have it divided into subjects. And so there's math, there's language, history, science, biology. And of course, it'll be in from the beginning to the end in each of those subcategories. So, you know, they can see like that it's in an order, but it could be divided into topics. And what's really kind of a great idea to do, you know, what's helpful for you as a teacher is that you can see, oh my goodness, their math tab is like this fat, and their history tab is very short, or their biology tab is very short. I wonder, like, if I need to give them some more lessons in those areas, or, you know, it gives you some information if one area is particularly large and another area isn't. And, you know, because the portfolio needs to include a wide range of student work in all areas, you want to make sure they have math in there, they have writing, they have the different topics of study and cosmic education. You want them to have an art area in there. Even music and practical life tabs would be wonderful too. So you want to have the wide range of topics in there. And if you look in a portfolio and you see that some areas are thin, that gives you more information about what you might need to do to support the student in growing and learning and developing in those areas. Portfolios also, this isn't necessarily self-assessment, but I'm just going to tell you, I think it's one of the best ways for a teacher to reflect on their own classroom lessons and practices and inform your future planning. You know, you can go in there and say, oh my goodness, this child is having a really hard time with their verb tenses, you know, and keeping the tenses the same. And so maybe we need to do a couple of lessons on verb tense, or this child is having a hard time with quotations or transitions in paragraphs or things like that. And that's going to help you when you see they put their best work in there and there are some gaps in their best work of things that, you know, maybe their writing skills and conventions or math, you know, oh, maybe, you know, this child is forgetting to put commas in their numbers, you know, indicating the place value and the families. And the categories. So I'm going to help them. We need to have a lesson on where we put our commas in numbers. So you're going to learn a lot from these portfolios. So the children are self-assessing, and you're also doing some assessing and learning through their portfolios. Another thing you're going to want to look at, it's very important, is open-ended self-assessment questions. And again, as you are asking them these kind of questions, they're going to be integrating these questions into their own internal dialogue that they're having. And that's going to help them learn how to self-assess. So you're going to want to ask them, you know, what are some ways that you figured that out? What would you like to learn more about this topic? How is this strategy helping you? What about your work is or isn't the way you wanted it to be? What do you know about this topic? What do you not yet know about this topic? You know, you want to ask them these kinds of questions, and you might even want to create like a little cue card or a checklist with these questions so that they can ask themselves. After you've done this a little bit in lessons or in conferencing with the children, you're going to definitely want to give them some opportunities to do that independently. And a checklist is sort of a middle ground between you asking those questions and them asking themselves those questions. So yes, open-ended, the great thing about open-ended self-assessment questions is that you can be asking those often to the children throughout the day, and then they're going to incorporate that into their own internal dialogue. The more you say them, the more you model that. And also you can model assessing your own work when you're doing something. I'm always telling teachers that they should participate in some of the projects that the children are doing alongside them, particularly if you have a young class of only 6 and 7-year-olds. Sometimes you have to be the older child in the classroom. And part of that experience of being the older child is you modeling self-assessment questioning and asking yourself these questions as well. So how do we teach self-assessment? I mean, we've been kind of talking about this along the way. So you're going to want to observe and provide feedback and support as the students self-assess. So you want to be there at the beginning when they are self-assessing and just really scaffolding that experience and facilitating that experience so that they have the proper supports in place for that. You're also going to want to provide opportunities for students to discuss their self-assessment. Again, this is perfect for the elementary child. If you do a small group, maybe you did a lesson on writing a summary and they had a rubric, and then you can have them pair up together and say, okay, how about you each take turns talking about how you self-assessed your written summary and what your thoughts are around this written summary that you created. Anytime you can create opportunities for negotiation and discussion and collaboration is going to be wonderful. Teachers also need to provide ongoing support for self-assessment. So this isn't something that you're just provide at the beginning and you sort of leave them to it. As they get more independent, they can be doing it a lot less, and that's wonderful. But I mean, in terms of not they're doing it a lot less, you are involved a lot less, but you still want to be involved in that process, because as they get older, you're going to want to enrich their self-assessment vocabulary, because there's going to be a shared vocabulary for your self-assessment process that you will be developing, and that's going to be an important thing for you to be scaffolding as they grow older. You also need to provide time, opportunity for discussion, and structure. And again, in a Montessori environment where the children are working independently, I think that this best can be conducted in a small group lesson format. Although there are some times where you might want to do a whole group lesson on it, like, hey, everybody, let's talk about what does quality work mean to you? And that might be something that the whole class wants to have sort of as an overarching big picture understanding that you can have somewhere posted in your classroom, or they can have it laminated on a shelf. But then when you want to drill down more deeply into the self-assessment process and you're teaching it, the children are going to be at varying levels with self-assessment. So you're going to want to individualize that experience. You know, with your 6 and 7-year-olds, there might be a lot of like teaching them how to verbally self-assess, you know, and whereas as they get older, you want to have them do written reflections and looking at rubrics and things like that. So, so yeah, oral assessments and portfolios are great for your younger children, and then your older children, written self-reflections and rubrics and checklists are going to be really helpful for them to develop their skills and improve their quality of work. So I hope that you learned a few things about the self-assessment process today, and that you can get excited to work with your students on engaging in self-assessment. Like everything, you know, don't get so overwhelmed where you feel like you need to jump in and have them self-assessing everything right away. Just take, you know, just take one time a week or one time every 2 weeks where you are trying to get a child to do some self-assessment in one way or another, and then slowly incorporate it a little bit more and more into your practice. But start small. You don't need to start out huge. You can, and the smallest and easiest ways to start are talking with them about what constitutes high quality work and having them put that in their portfolios that they can self-assess. and also oral questioning and asking questions and helping them learn what you are asking for, and helping them ask themselves, what kind of questions do I need to ask myself when I am assessing my own work? So anyway, I'm excited to know that you will all be implementing some self-assessment techniques, because even though it's a little bit harder at the beginning, it's going to make your life easier in the long run as your students become more independent and self-directed learners. Thank you very much. It was wonderful having you today in this webinar, and you might be seeing me in future webinars.